Okay, so today we will talk about lice and typhus. Lice and typhus, a famous scourge of humanity with respect to many different wars and human historical events. Lice and typhus play a big role in that. So, the history of typhus. Okay, let's talk first about the history of typhus. First documented reported epidemic of typhus in recorded history is in during the Spanish Civil War for Granada. So Granada, if this is Spain, here's the Mediterranean. There was a period after the Crusades where the Arabs, the Moors, I think it's written like this, the Moors had conquered Spain. And after the Crusades, there was a Spanish Civil War because the Moors held this chunk of Spain, Granada. And so the goal was for the Spaniards to push out the Moors. And this war was part of that effort, the War for Granada. So this is in the year 1489, 1490. And it's thought that Spanish sailors from Cyprus, so Cyprus is a little island in the Mediterranean. It's thought that Spanish sailors from Cyprus picked up the epidemic, the typhus pathogen, and the lice, as we'll learn about. And they sort of, as they were fighting then in this war, spread it. And this was the first documented case where 20,000 people died in this instance. And then after that, typhus spread through Spain. It was probably around, since the dawn of humanity, I would expect. But this was the first recorded instance of many, many people dying of typhus in history. Okay, so from then on, typhus pops up in essentially every combat, every sort of like war since. And there's big events in which typhus plays a big role. So after that, in the 1570s, the Spanish conquistadors were some of the early arrivals in the New World, right? And they arrived in Mexico. And at that time, there was a population of the Aztecs who were in Central America and Mexico at that time. And this is a point of debate, but this is a hypothesis that when I'm trying to remember, what's the guy's name? The famous guy, Cortez. Cortez is the famous Spaniard conquistador. When Cortez arrived, after that, the hypothesis is that 2 million indigenous there'd be Native Americans, Aztecs, died from typhus when those conquistadors brought typhus to the New World. So it's thought that typhus was not in the New World and that this was the event that brought typhus to the New World. But this is kind of very difficult to prove things like this, unless in the case of like the plague pathogen, maybe you go back and you find graves and you can find perhaps some bacterial samples in teeth and things like that. But this is a hypothesis for how typhus arrived into the New World. And obviously this is a common pattern in vector biology, which we've seen when I discussed Plasmodium vivax and falciparum being transmitted to the New World. When all the Europeans started finding the New World, they brought over all the diseases. Okay. So more about history and wars. These are some later examples of when typhus pops up in history in some of these different wars. Many examples of this. The most famous example, and I've said this before in the class, the most famous example is after Napoleon conquered Europe, he embarked on a campaign to invade and conquer Russia. This is in 1812. And he brought, and if you know anything about Russia, like Russia spans essentially like half the world, like all the way around. So it's a very, very long walk from Europe into the heart of Russia. And he invaded during the winter and brought about 700,000 troops. And of that, 3,000 survived, and half of those died entirely from typhus. So this is the famous example where an army was literally like marched into Russia, and they all died from typhus. World War I. During World War I and the Russian Revolution, epidemic typhus and murine typhus, which we'll talk about, was sort of like endemic in the trenches. So if you know about World War I was all about the trench warfare, and they would dig the trenches and they would essentially like dig lines, and they would sit in the lines and they would shoot at each other across no man's land. That's sort of like the gist of World War I. And in those trenches was gigantic epidemics of typhus, causing mass casualties. After that, after World War I, or actually right at the end of World War I, there was the Russian Revolution, where Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution happened. So Lenin is this charismatic communist figure who sort of preaches, and then there's sort of a Russian Revolution during the end of the last phases of World War I. And then during this, and then there was a Russian Civil War, and during that Civil War, about 30 million cases of typhus happened, with about 3 million deaths. So many, many, many millions of people have died from typhus during wars. And as we go into the epidemiology of this, you'll understand kind of like why this happens during wars, but also too, just because again, lots of people moving around and cramping together in sort of dirty conditions that will foment typhus. Typhus in World War II. Okay, so here's some factoids. Typhus killed hundreds of thousands of prisoners. So these are in the Nazi concentration camps. So many of the Jewish prisoners in the Nazi concentration camps died of typhus in those poor conditions. American soldiers by that time had a vaccine. And if I go, actually, I'll just jump ahead and talk about this now. We were fortunate in a sense that we had Rickettsia prausechii vaccine, which was called the Cox Vaccine, which was established just in time, sort of before we sent our troops into these theaters of war in World War II. And the reason we got this vaccine was the vaccine was actually developed at RML, which is the Rocky Mountain Labs. So we all know now the history of Rocky Mountain Labs. Rocky Mountain Labs has many important contributions to vector biology. And the Cox vaccine for typhus was developed at the Rocky Mountain Labs. And at the Rocky Mountain Labs, of course, what were they experts on there? Well, they're experts on rickettsia, right? I mean, at that point, because yeah, they had studied rickettsii, which is Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and they're also studying typhus, right? Howard Taylor Ricketts actually died studying typhus, although at that point he was in Mexico. But the RML has a long history of studying rickettsial diseases. And there was actually a sort of like fluke event where a researcher, Harold Cox, was trying to develop a vaccine. One of the things, if you're going to develop sort of like an attenuated or a killed vaccine or a heat shock vaccine, whatever, you got to grow the pathogen and then you kill it, and then that's what you inject to stimulate the immune system. So you actually have to be able to grow the pathogen. And what do we know about rickettsial organisms? Growing rickettsial organisms, they're in cells. So this was a very difficult thing to do. And there was just sort of like, and the way that they cultured them at the time, right, was, I don't know actually if this is true for prausechii, but I'm assuming they have an animal model, like a guinea pig or perhaps monkeys, maybe guinea pigs probably, where they're passing the organism, but it's hard to get enough for a vaccine. And so one day there was just sort of a chance event where Harold Cox did not have any reagents, and he sort of just went to the local chicken farmer and got some eggs, and then was just like, well, I'll just try to inject these into inject this Rickettsia parasecii into these chicken eggs. And supposedly in the chicken egg, in the developing embryo, these are fertilized chicken eggs, there's an egg yolk and then what's called like egg yolk sac, I think, which is like around the egg yolk. And if you inject the Rickettsia parasecii into the egg yolk sac, as the chicken develops, it will robustly grow inside the system. So there was actually like a system of in vitro culture of Rickettsia parasecii, and what they would do is they just get a bunch of eggs, and then they would inject the eggs with the Rickettsia parasecii, and then they would extract the Rickettsia to make the vaccine. So fortunately, because of this accident, our troops had a typhus vaccine, epidemic typhus vaccine, when we entered World War II. So again, just sort of like now you kind of understand this. Any situations that create sort of like large concentrations of people with low hygiene are areas where you're going to see typhus. And we do see again, like there's recent reports of typhus in Los Angeles, in San Francisco. Anytime you have mass migrations, famines, natural disasters, refugee camps, things like that, that's where typhus pops up. So it's sort of like the scourge of people who are already in already bad situations. Okay. The vector of typhus is the human body louse. Okay. So just quick about the vector, and we'll go into great detail in terms of its evolution. These are hematophagous insects. So they drink blood. We're back into the insects now with the fleas and the lice. So we're out of the ticks, out of the mites, out of the acari. We're back in the insects. They drink human blood. And usually the way that they spread the pathogen is, again, kind of similar to the flea in a sense that they take an infected blood meal, and then what happens is they either like poop it out or regurgitate it out, and then oftentimes the human will scratch that frass, I guess you'd call it, into the itchy bite, or it was in theory regurgitated out into the bite. And so that's usually how typhus spreads, and it gets scratched into the skin. So there's 3 different types of lice. Let me just make sure I didn't miss any of these, if any of these points are very important. This is worth just talking about in a sense that the reason we call this epidemic typhus is because almost more than any of the other vector biology diseases, epidemic typhus can really like explode. And so there are cases where it really can just go to insane levels. So that's why we call it epidemic typhus. Okay, 3 different types of body lice. Do I have a slide for this? I already talked about this. Okay, so there's 3 different types of body lice. I'll just quick write it out here. I think I have a slide later. One is the head louse. One is the body louse. And then the last one is the crab louse. The 1 and 2, head lice and body lice, those are the ones that can spread epidemic typhus. In the field, it's always the body louse. So while like experiments prove that the head louse can transmit typhus, it never happens in the field. It's always the body louse. Okay, so let's talk about lice evolution. This is the body louse. These are, I can't tell if these are eggs or I'm sure this is a mix of eggs. Yeah, these are the nits. Those are the eggs. So the thing about body lice is body lice have evolved to be in clothing. Okay, so you can imagine people who share clothing, people who only have one outfit, people who are in cold weather so they don't change their clothes very often, people who don't wash their clothes very often, perhaps because they don't have that many outfits, or perhaps because it's very cold, or perhaps because they're walking or in a trench. Those are the people who get typhus. Okay, so it's under conditions where you're not changing and washing your clothes, because the body louse has specifically evolved, like almost literally like evolved to like be on your body, but also like more so almost in your clothes. So this is an interesting picture. This is an interesting fact that a human body, in theory, can support 30,000 body lice. So again, this can explode exponentially. So the human body has a pretty high carrying capacity for how many lice you can support on your body. Okay. We talked about this last in the flea lecture. I'll review it just a little bit. So in insects, there's an ancestral sort of like insect-like clade where there are no wings. Okay. And then there's a clade with wings. Maybe clade is not the right word, but there's like a grouping of insects with wings. And we talked last time about how fleas were in the group of which came from insects with wings, but they had lost their wings. The deal's the same with lice, the lousy evolution. I make that joke multiple times, where they have given up their wings and they've lost their wings, but they descend from insects that have wings. And also, let me talk about how they're different from fleas. So, in these vectors that have lost their wings but suck your blood, right? There's also below the wing dichotomy, there's a bifurcation where we produced, or not we produced, but insects evolved hemimetabolous and holometaboly life cycles. Okay, so the fleas are where? Holometaboly or hemimetaboly? Fleas. Thank you, holo. Fleas are holometaboly. Because I talked about how the pupae make silk. That might be an interesting way to remember that. Lice are hemimetabolous. Okay, so they're not anywhere close to the fleas. And actually, their sister group is Hemiptera. So if you know insects, there's a group of insects. They kind of look like this, like box elder bugs, where they have like a beak. The proboscis is like a sharp beak, and they're famous for like sucking like plant juices, things like that. They're often spread diseases in plants. Lice are a sister group to Hemiptera, and they also have, the sucking lice especially have actual like hemipteran like beaks, which I think we'll show in a little bit. So they're closely related to hemipterans. So, okay, let me ask another question. Since we talked about how both lice and fleas have lost their wings, did this happen one point in evolution, or did it happen twice in evolution where these different insects lost their wings? Like yeah, it happened twice. So this is a case of sort of like convergent, you could call it convergent evolution, but maybe it's like convergent devolution, where they're actually like losing the functionality of a structure, although probably, I mean, to become more fit. So it's convergent evolution. But these are two different examples where insects have lost their wings. And again, what's the similar scenario? Why would they be able to lose their wings? Yeah, like they have found their source of food and they just want to be on you. They just want to be by you. They don't, once they find you, they don't need no wings. They just want to hold on to you. So they've sort of been able to lose their wings, and wings are probably pretty expensive in terms of like development. So they probably gain a lot by losing wings if they can just cling to your body. Okay, so more on the evolution. The order is Theraptera, lice. There's two. This would be maybe this is a great example of why this is a lousy evolution slide. There's a non-monophyletic clade, which we call Melophaga. So what's the context of that? There's two sort of like colloquial types of lice. Ones we call the chewing lice, and ones we call the sucking lice. Okay, and the chewing lice are the Melophaga or Malophaga. I don't quite know how to pronounce it. But the Malophaga is considered non. What do I call it? It's a non-monophyletic clade. What's a monophyletic clade? Yes, so a monophyletic clade exactly would be one ancestor, and then like all the descendants are all. This would be a monophyletic clade. A paraphyletic clade is, I think, the correct term, or you could also say a non-monophyletic clade. That's kind of like a false grouping. And the reason we made a false grouping in lice is because they use this morphological distinction between chewing and sucking lice to originally like classify them. They're like, oh, they're either here or they're there. And then what was found out was that chewing lice are not derived from one common ancestor. They have different ancestors. So the chewing lice is not monophyletic, that grouping. So in that sense, it's not technically accurate, but it's still used colloquially because it's very useful to distinguish between chewing and sucking lice. That's the gist of this. Annupleura are the sucking lice. I probably spelled that wrong. Annupleura in your notes. You probably want to know Malophaga and Annupleura. So a couple things about the chewing lice. And these are the, let's see, Sochoptera are book lice. These are now the new names. So these are the sucking lice, and then these groups are what we call the chewing lice. So you don't need to know these names. I don't know these names. I've heard Amblycera. You hear that a lot. Ischnocera, Rhinocera. You don't need to know those names. But no, Malophaga, chewing lice, and sucking lice. You kind of just want to know there's chewing lice and sucking lice. The gist with the chewing lice is many of the chewing lice, the chewers are usually like bird lice, whereas the sucking lice are mammal lice. And we saw this pattern kind of also with the fleas. Many of the fleas were sort of like evolved for mammals. Lice are kind of the same. Many of the sucking lice are on mammals, but then you do find bird lice, which are the chewing groups. And it's thought that the chewing bird lice are the more ancestral groups, as you can kind of see from this tree. The mammalian sucking lice are sort of newer in evolution. Okay. I talked about that. This was just a slide to show you what I already said, that there was a hemipteran ancestor. And here's the Theraptera, which are the lice. Here's Sochoptera, which are book lice. Here's Hemiptera. And so you can see they share from a common hemipteroid ancestor, which is probably why those mouth parts look like that. A couple more things. I say here that their lice are, let's see, do I go to this one? Not yet. A couple things about lice. Lice are obligate. I don't know what the best word be. Obligate ectoparasites. What does that mean when I say that? What? Well, ectoparasites live outside on the body, but what do I mean by obligate in this sense? Well, no, that's not what I mean. These are insects, so there's no way they could live inside of a cell. They're far bigger than a cell. So we're not talking about bacteria here, we're talking about ectoparasites. What I mean by obligate is like if they fall off, they're not like the flea. If they fall off, they die within 3 hours. They're extremely sensitive to temperature. They want to be at 98.7 degrees if they're human lice, because that's literally like the temperature where they're clinging to your body. So they're extremely sensitive to temperature, and they need to be on the host or they die. Or, I mean, in the host's clothing right next to the body. But like the fleas, there's different species. So there's they speciate with their hosts. So there's a species of like gorilla louse, of like chimp louse, of human louse, and the particular mammal, each mammal has their own species of ectoparasite, and we actually have a couple, like I said. So the essence of a louse is that it's clingy. They cling to you for their life. Okay, the three different types of lice: head louse, body louse, crab louse. Here, head louse, body louse, crab louse. So the pubic louse is obviously like completely different, totally different. These two, A and B, head louse and body louse, they're actually considered the same species, but they're beginning to speciate. And we can see this in the genomes. They're beginning to become different. And you can mate them still. They can mate, they can hybridize. And so they're still the same species. But they are drastically differently evolved for like where they live. Question, what is it?
The different type of lice, are they different in genus and species, or are they just different?
I say that here. So the crab louse, maybe I don't have the crab louse species on this. Yeah, I do. Here's the crab louse species, Thurus pubis. It's a different genus. The two head and body louse are Pediculus humanus, and I usually put this on the test. And I usually also put the human flea on the test, which is a different. So the humanus is body louse. Humanus capitis is head louse, right? That makes sense, like, because the capital is like on the top. So those are the species names. So these are different in a sense that we've shown pictures of the claws before. Okay, so the head louse, the claws are specifically evolved to the diameter to hold the head hair. The pubic claws are different, and the body louse lives in clothing. So they actually like are different. This one, the body louse, is the vector for typhus. That's the one we worry about. They don't mate in the wild. I'm just looking at the other things that are worth saying. Okay. So let's ask the question, like, why is this happening? Why do we have two lice, and I'm talking about head and body? Like, why are they starting to diverge? Well, let's go into that question and let's think about that. How would they be evolving differently? And what was it in human evolution that sort of made us get these kind of like two things that are kind of similar but kind of different? One idea is that, I think I have a slide for this. One idea is that in human evolution, there was a point on the earth at which Homo sapiens coexisted with Homo erectus. So these were two different species of like things that are like humans. Homo sapiens are humans, but Homo erectus was like shared a common ancestor with Homo sapiens. I don't know if we directly, I don't know human evolution enough to know if we're direct descendant or share common ancestor. I'm assuming we share common ancestor with Homo erectus. So one thought is that Homo erectus, while it was on the earth, had its own body lice, and Homo sapiens were on the earth and we had our own body lice. And these were similar enough that interactions between the two, maybe one could get both. And so maybe what we're actually seeing in this sort of like divergence is maybe what we're seeing is we're actually seeing Homo erectus's louse now living on Homo sapiens louse because Homo erectus eventually went extinct. So maybe we're seeing actually two different lice that were on two different things at one point, but now since Homo erectus went extinct, they're both on us. That's one thought. Another thought is at some point, right, humans lost their fur. We lost our fur at some point. And so if you're a body louse, where are you going to go if humans lose their fur? You're laughing. You're not going to go down there. That's different. That's the crab louse. Well, I guess in theory you could. But what happened was, as they lost their hair, right? Like, one thought is maybe one louse went up there where there's still hair. We all still have hair on our heads. And what simultaneously happens when humans lose their hair and start moving into colder environments? They start wearing clothes. So one other thought is that as humans lost their hair, we start wearing clothing, and then that sort of facilitated, well, one louse went up there and one louse started like living in the clothing. Yeah, there probably would for sure be a temperature difference in if you're wearing clothing close to the body, and then on the head, maybe your head was probably exposed. So that might induce some differences there. But just kind of interesting things that are happening in lice evolution. So the pubic louse, this is also interesting. The pubic louse essentially shares a common ancestor. The closest thing to it is a gorilla louse. So I don't know what the theory is for like where or how we got that, but that's the closest relative of the pubic louse, is actually the gorilla louse.
When you say gorilla louse, you mean gorilla pubic louse or gorilla louse?
Like all over their body, like gorillas like living in the jungle, their lice, their body lice, and they probably only have one kind of, okay, I'm making a guess here, but I'm guessing they only have one kind of louse because they have their fur all over their bodies. And so their louse is most closely related to our pubic louse. Okay, when you hear the term cooties, that was actually a term that was referring to lice. Okay, their morphology. So their morphology is interesting. I've talked about this multiple times. Their claws are evolved to hold on, to cling on to hair, but also their body. Their body is actually, this is maybe a misleading picture. Their body is not round. It's actually very flat. Why would they want a flattened body, like almost like a bed bug? This one is obviously blood fed. It's engorged. That's probably why it's round. But why would they want a flat body? What? No, not well. I don't know if it'd make it harder for you to see them. I don't necessarily know if I think that, but they want to cling close to the body, and they want high surface area touching the body to get that heat. So they flatten themselves out, and they probably also don't want to be like crushed or squished. They have to essentially, like, if you have a skin and then like clothing here, they need to like flatten themselves out to be in the space. So they're flat. Their legs have evolved to clasp hairs. If they drop off a human or their host, they'll die within 3 hours. They're highly specially evolved to their ectoparasitic host. So these are the mouth parts. So quick quiz. Which one of these is the sucking lice? It's actually B, Annuplera. And this is the beak I was talking about, where it's pointing down this way. This thing does look interesting. This one does look like it is a sucking louse. But this is in the chewing louse classification. The major point here, I'm highlighting the mouth parts. The major point here is like, look at that. That's a chewing louse. Looks totally different than that, which is a sucking louse. Okay, so you can tell from their mouth parts probably what they're doing. The Rhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhynchorhyn sort of like a transition. It looks more like almost like a transition louse. It's interesting. And I think that one is actually, yeah, it looks like that one is actually kind of like in a transitory group. between chewing and sucking. So it's interesting that that one morphologically looks maybe like a mix of the two. Their eggs are also highly evolved, and how their eggs hatch is also really interesting. So their eggs are called nits. These are the nits. They have special proteins, and they glue their eggs to your hair. So this is the glue, and they glue their egg. And the way that the louse gets out, so if this is the egg, there's like a capsule on the top. Okay, that's that thing or this thing. And the way that the louse gets out is it sucks in air. So if here's the head and here's like the end of the louse, it sucks in air and then it farts it out and it builds up pressure behind until it can pop the cap off the egg, and then it can crawl and then it pops out. So it's like an interesting mechanism through which they have figured out how to like exit these eggs. Okay, more other interesting facts. So in like the early days of like 1700s, right? Like right when like the founding fathers were around and like doing the American Revolution, what was like the style back then for the hair? The wigs, right? Like everybody wore like the wigs, and what they did underneath is they would shave their head. So they'd shave their head and they would wear these wigs. The reason that was actually the style, like the reason that they did that was because everybody had head lice. And so like to prevent getting head lice, you essentially would just shave your head, and then when you would go out, you would put on these wigs, which you knew could be cleaned or didn't have wigs. So it was actually like a preventative means of preventing yourself from getting lice, which is really interesting. Yeah, they shave their heads underneath the wig. Well, then it works out even easier. You don't have to shave your head if you're bald. Okay. And so an interesting thing about this is like our generation, well, maybe not our generation, but like ever since like the washing machine was invented, we're probably like the first generations to actually live without lice. Like lice for all human history has been like a thing that is always on people. You just deal with it. Like you have head lice, you have body lice. Like it's just always there. We're probably like the first, maybe not, again, like I said, maybe not we, but maybe in the 1950s or whatever, when they first invented like washing machines and dryers, that was probably when lice started to like go away. Unless you're living in like weird living situations or living in strange communities, you will still get lice. No comment. I don't judge people's lifestyles. I'm just saying if you live in a sense where you're not changing your clothes, you're more likely to get lice. Okay, so the more interesting things about lice. Lice, and this is a good sort of like topic in entomology to sort of just talk about in general. Lice have a mycetome. What's a mycetome? Do we know? So mycetomes are a special, almost like an organ, a special organ, but it might not be like as big of as an organ. It's in general what you think of. It's like a specialized place in the body that holds symbionts. So not all symbionts are like Wolbachia, where, well, I guess maybe the mycetome of Wolbachia would be like the ovaries or the testes. But some symbionts kind of like invade the tissue and are just kind of like everywhere. You could see why that would be kind of maybe potentially pathogenic to the insect. In many cases, the insect really wants to regulate where the symbiont is localized. And so what they do is they create like a special little home, or which is called the mycetome, for their symbionts, and they sort of like pool their symbionts in these tissues. So lice have this, the mycetome. Here's a picture of it. And they have their own symbiont, which is called Candidatus rhiesa pediculocola. What's the gist of the Candidatus? Those who know microbiology. Yeah, it's still a candidate. Why would things be still a candidate and not named? We have the genome for this thing. Why is it still candidate?
Maybe just like it splits into two. They got a picture of what specifically goes on there.
No, that's not why. There's actually like rules in naming microbial organisms, which perhaps nowadays are outdated. But one of the rules is you can't name it if you can't culture it. And so many of the things that are unculturable have strange names that start with Candidatus because it's uncultivable. But it doesn't mean it's not real, or it doesn't mean it's not there. And it doesn't really even mean it's a candidate. It just means like it's got this old thing associated with its name because it can't be cultured. And this symbiont, the rhiesa symbiont, is essential. If you cure the lice, they will die during their first molt. So it's an essential symbiont. It's probably doing something. It's probably providing something. And it has a reduced genome of about 600 orfs. So that's interesting to me. It's about half the size of Wolbachia. So it's very, very small genome. But it has a symbiont. It's worth talking about. Okay. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything. I'll go into a tangent here if I have time at the end. Okay, so now let's talk about typhus. The 3 types of typhus. So there's epidemic typhus, which is louse-borne, which is Rickettsia prowsecii. There's endemic typhus, which is transmitted by the rat flea or the cat flea. We call this murine typhus. So, and this organism, the pathogen is actually different. Okay, so it's still Rickettsia, but it's Rickettsia typhi. So there's different types of typhus Rickettsia. And then there's also scrub typhus, which we had a lecture on, which is not Rickettsia. It's a different bacteria, but closely related, Orientia tsutsugamushi, spread by the mites. Okay, so there's different forms of typhus. So if you just say typhus, that doesn't necessarily specify enough information. Epidemic typhus means it's the louse-borne Rickettsia prowsecii. Endemic typhus means it's rat flea, cat flea. I should go to this tree. I have a tree of these Rickettsia. Let's just kind of like look at this now, and let's talk about this tree. So this is a tree of rickettsial evolution. Okay, so Rickettsia bellii is kind of like this ancestral Rickettsia, and then more internally, there are these different groupings of Rickettsia. So there's the spotted fever group, Rickettsia, and we can see here that we should be able to find Rickettsia rickettsii, which spreads what? RMSF. And what was Rickettsia peacockii? That was the non-pathogenic one across the river. So you can see they're sisters. Okay, but these are spotted fever grouping Rickettsia. So things like this that are pathogenic tend to cause things that I guess are more like Rocky Mountain spotted fever stuff. And then there's typhus group, TG, that's typhus group Rickettsia, which just includes prowsecii and typhi. So this is the murine typhus. This is the epidemic typhus. Okay, and then in between these are what we call transitional group Rickettsia. Rickettsia felis, which is actually, it is a pathogen spread by cat fleas. And this is considered to be a transitional group Rickettsia. So just remember that there's different types of Rickettsia, and you do want to know their species. I will for sure on the test be like, Rickettsia rickettsii does what? Rickettsia prausechii does what? You want to know the main ones. You don't need to know these like weird ones, but you want to know the main ones. What? No, there will be, that's not true. There will be a third test. The final, there will be no final. And there will be a presentation in lieu of the final. There will be another third test, though. Sorry to get your hopes up. Last one wasn't even hard. Let's just briefly review what are the characteristics of those Rickettsia organisms. We already said one thing, they're obligate, intracellular. What else about them can you remember with respect to Rickettsia? Where do they live? That's an organism through which they can be passed. They live in the cytoplasm. They live in the cytoplasm. That's different from Ehrlichia, Wolbachia, Anaplasma, which live in a vacuole. Rickettsia live in the cytoplasm. Rickettsia themselves have reduced genomes, and so they actually have lost their ability to synthesize ATP. How do they survive if they can't make ATP? Nope. There's no other pathway.
Wait, they can't make ATP?
They can't make ATP. That's my question. They steal it. They have an ATP transporter on their membrane. So on their membrane, they load their membrane with ATP transporters, and then they live in the cytoplasm, which has ATP. So they'll just pump ATP in from the host. So you can see, one second, you can see how they are parasitic and potentially, I mean, one reason why they might be so pathogenic because they steal from the host to survive. Okay, what?
I was going to ask, is that why one of the symptoms for the RMS was a defunction?
Well, I mean, if you get sick with anything, you're going to be weak. I don't know if you could biochemically say it's because they're like stealing your ATP, but perhaps, I mean, that would probably contribute to it. But I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say like mechanistically, that's why you feel tired, if that makes sense. So this is another thing worth talking about. I don't know if I have a slide for this. It doesn't matter. Again, like another really interesting thing, I love finding these things in vector biology because they're just so interesting. Like the flea, like the Yersinia, which aggregates itself at the proventriculus and blocks the flow of food into the flea, and so then the flea gets hungry and it starts biting more and starts vomiting to spread the disease more. There's something very similar in typhus. So there's a positive feedback loop like that in typhus and lice, louse, lice. But the mechanism is a little bit different, but it's essentially the same thing. So if you have a louse and it gets infected with Rickettsia prausechii in the gut, Rickettsia prausechii in the gut invade and replicate inside of the gut cells of the louse. And so what's going to happen to that insect's gut? Yes, you did it with your hands. What explain to me in words what you just motioned. What? You did this. It'll dissolve the gut. The gut will literally like dissolve. And so what happens if you are a louse and your gut dissolves? Are you going to be able to get nutrition efficiently? No. So you're going to feel hungry, you're going to bite more, and you're going to vomit more, and you're going to and you're going to perhaps maybe pass things through or poop things out. So the mechanism of which like typhus, Rickettsia prausechii changes the behavior of the louse to feed more is very similar in a sense to the flea, but different mechanism. So I like to point that out because it's really interesting. This would be another case of convergent evolution where you see some kind of a similar pattern. Pathogen is figuring out a way to make itself transmitted. Yeah.
And does that make it under the character like vector? Because as a vector, it's going to be affected by the transmission of the pathogen.
So I see what you're saying. The pathogen does not, well, the pathogen does not want to kill the reservoir. Does it care if it kills the vector after it's transported? So it's a little bit different when you're talking about the vector and the reservoir. And I say that a lot where I say the pathogen does not want to kill the reservoir, right? Because that's where it's like sitting around. But the vector is just a temporary thing where it's transporting it. So it doesn't want to kill it while it's transporting it, sure. But it doesn't really care if it dies or kills the vector after it's already transmitted. And typhus is actually one condition where it does kill the louse terminally. So if the louse gets this, it's dead. But it spreads it enough for it to persist before it dies. Let me just look to see if there's anything else worth mentioning. So the other thing that's very similar, but a little bit different is in the case of the flea, when the pathogen or when the host of the flea died, it would jump to a new host. In the case of lice and typhus, if a louse is on a human and the human gets typhus, what's going to happen to the human's body temperature? The it's going to get a fever, the human's going to get a fever, and the body temperature is going to go up. And I just told you how lice are very, very sensitive to human temperature. So are they going to like this or are they not going to like this? They're not going to like this because the temperature is going to go up. And they're going to start moving then. I mean, they're not going to be as mobile as like a jumping flea, but they're going to start moving, and they might start moving out into outer parts of your clothes and might start trying to get to different pieces of clothing. And if people are close together, perhaps they move from person to person. Has anybody ever seen a louse move? Yeah, for sure. They can walk. I mean, they have legs. They can walk. And I mean, head lice will crawl around. They'll move. And I think, don't head lice, like, I don't know, for some reason, like you think of head lice jumping, but they wouldn't jump. Probably just carried in transmission. But yeah, they move. They can walk. But they don't jump like fleas. I think we can end there. Let me just end with a couple final comments. The typhus, we can treat it with antibiotics. We treat it with doxycycline, just like many of these other rickettsial diseases. So it's not horrible if you get it now. We can treat it. But before antibiotics, it was had a very high death rate. You get similar symptoms to kind of like Rocky Mountain spotted fever. You'll get these papular rashes. And it will kill you. You essentially, the way that you die is very similar. Again, it leaks blood out, and so you essentially have organ failure because your blood's not effectively carrying oxygen to the tissues where they need them to go, because your blood is leaking out all over because it's destroyed your endothelial lining. That's how it's pathogenic. That's it. Nasty disease. Okay, let's end there. The next lecture is